how rare is it that the two greatest players of their respective generations go head-to-head in a sport? For basketball, that would be like Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant, or Michael Jordan and LeBron James. For mixed martial arts, it would be something like Anderson Silva and Israel Adesanya. And for chess, that would be Magnus Carlsen and Garry Kasparov. But the two of them are 28 years apart in age, and Garry retired in 2005, which is when Magnus was about 14, 15 years old. But they did have a chance to play against each other in 2004 in a tournament in Reykjavik, Iceland, a rapid tournament where Garry was paid to participate as well as other top grandmasters. In this video, I'm going to take you through the 3 games they played against each other, and we're also going to look at footage from this video. The day before the rapid tournament began, Magnus and Kasparov actually played a blitz game against each other, and actually all the players played some blitz games against each other. This is that blitz game. So Garry's got the white pieces, and he begins with c4. Magnus responds with knight f6, knight c3, and g6. So he's going for bishop g7, and he'll probably decide whether or not he'll move a d-pawn. But when Garry plays g3, Magnus turns the position into something more or less completely symmetrical. And Garry, rather than playing a slow maneuvering game where everything is completely in the balance, chooses to now play knight to f3, and this move, d4. This is one way you can imbalance a position which looks symmetrical in the early stages of the game. You can offer a trade of pawns in the center, and that's exactly what Garry does. So we have takes, takes, and bishop to d7, reinforcing that knight, which now the knight and the bishop for Garry see. So Garry castles, Magnus plays bishop g7, looking to finish his development. Garry takes, Magnus takes back, and now rather than trading the bishops, because Garry wants his bishop, he takes some more central space with the move e4, Magnus castles, and Garry finishes this development. So far, so good. So far, you and I are just on the same page as these two. Except now they're going to prove how good they are, you're going to prove that you're a YouTube viewer, and I'm going to prove that I'm a dude in a pink hoodie who just makes videos. So now we get a6 from Magnus Carlsen, looking to play b5 later on the queen side. Rook c1 by Garry. Garry not really concerned with this move b5. Magnus plays knight back to d7. The point of this is to activate the bishop on the diagonal, and also to reroute the knight to this side of the board, right? Not there, that would be illegal, but to that square. So we have queen e2, which seemingly prevents the move b5, and then, well, Magnus just plays b5 all the same. Because after c takes b5, a takes b5, yes, you can take, but then after takes, you see what you've done to black's position? You've opened it up. And Magnus's next move would have been rook takes pawn. Garry would have maybe played like b3 or b4, trying to preserve this pawn. And this pawn's nice, and it's also a pass pawn. But Garry's like, that pawn could be a little bit of a target. You know, to be honest, I don't really like the fact that black's position is so open. So instead of that, Garry just plays b4 himself. And now here, for reasons I don't quite understand, Magnus didn't take, which I thought was the whole point. But maybe he didn't like the fact that queen c4 would come, and then Garry has something called a 2-on-1, which is a queenside majority. And ultimately, you know, it's kind of similar to what we just saw. That one pawn will turn into a pass pawn. And, you know, it could be advancing in the middle game and could be a problem for Magnus in the endgame. So instead, Magnus played knight e5, putting some more pressure and basically forcing Garry to take at this point. The thing is, if you don't take, if you just push, then that knight lands on c4, it's hitting everybody, and it's guarded. So Garry decides to take, and is like, all right, I mean, you gotta play rook a2 now, kid. And for a reason I don't fully understand, Magnus Carlsen played queen to b8. Now, I can try to explain this move. I can't fully understand it, but I can try to explain it. Magnus's idea was that after queen takes, rook takes, look how brutal it is for white to guard their pawns. Now black's sacrifice makes sense. He sacrificed a couple of pawns, but he's got open lines. The problem is, here Garry goes full 2 birds, 1 stone. He plays a4. So now that pawn is not a target, and his queen is guarded. And after queen b5, a b5, this pawn's just going to go up 1 square and be guarded, and there's nothing you can do about it. In fact, after this move, rook b8, right, we got b6. And now, if you drop back to try to stop me, you're not going to be able to because my bishops are so strong. And here there's this very strong move, e5, which opens up a discovered attack on that rook, facilitates the movement of that pawn to b7. And now you just cannot, I mean, there's Magnus's kind of idea comes back to bite. Now it is a blitz game, and we get knight to g4, hitting the bishop and maybe trying to damage the structure. But here Garry, says, okay, well, what's worth more than you targeting my bishop? Remember that idea that Gotham Chess talked about in his YouTube video 17 years later? Yeah, well, here I have b7, which is just a beautiful move, because it attacks the rook. If you take, I push, and I laser beam you. And if you don't take, and you play a move like rook a2, your back rank is a problem. And now my pawn helps my rook escort to the back rank. It's check. There's nothing you can do. You take, I make a queen, and I take your knight, but you have bigger problems than me taking your knight. It's the fact that you're just down 1,000 points of material. So after the move b7, Magnus Carlsen actually resigned. Now, on record, this is the first ever game these two played against each other, okay? But this is not really covered on YouTube, which is funny. Instead, there is the next game that we're going to look at, which is the official first game in a tournament. This was that game that we just looked at was literally the first time they played against each other. So, you just witnessed history. Congratulations. And there's not much on that blitz game on YouTube, but there is a lot of video footage of this next game. This is the first round of the Rapid tournament. Let's take a brief look at how that went down.
Kasparov is a much feared opponent and the man Magnus will meet next. This is an historic moment. Kasparov has never played against anyone this young. Kasparov has been paid a lot of money to be at this tournament, but he is nowhere to be found. The others have already started their games and the clocks are ticking.
So imagine you're a tournament organizer and you're putting on Magnus Carlsen versus Garry Kasparov, and Garry Kasparov's not showing up. There's camera crew, family, spectators, and everybody waiting. Come on, Garry. Come play the kid. Oh, there he is. I think I see him. So Garry's finally arrived, and the players begin the game. Magnus plays d4. We have d5 by Garry, and you'll notice from the video that Garry already looked visibly distraught on move 1. To the untrained eye, that looks like, oh my god, this kid is so good. I don't know what to do. No, Garry knows so much about chess. It can sometimes be hard to choose what you want to play at what moment, like what gives you the best practical chance, right? So c4, c6. This is known as the Slav defense, and we have a transposition to what's known as the semi-Slav. Like right here, it's up to black to choose whether they want to play the open Slav, which is when you take on c4, or the semi-Slav. Magnus responds in very principled fashion with the move bishop g5, and then e3. So he only activates his light squared bishop after getting his dark squared bishop out. This is very common for black to put the knight on d7, reinforcing the knight on f6. You might notice that black's bishop on c8 is terrible, and you would notice correctly that bishop has a lifespan to kind of activate itself later. Black slowly gains space in this opening. That's just an opening. It's a preference. But Garry plays a variation with queen to a5, which already looks a bit weird, but it's a very confrontational move. Now, I've played this myself, so, Garry Kasparov and Gotham Chess, two of the greatest players of all time, have played this with black, so it must be pretty good. And the queen pins the knight to the king, and you also want to go knight here, because there's no pin there anymore. So it's a very direct way to play, which is actually why Magnus plays this move knight d2. This is the best move, and it's considered the main line, and it was considered the best move 17 years ago. Unless you're watching in 2027, in which case it was significantly more than that amount of years ago, but I'm recording this in 2021. That stops knight e4, and it also unpins like this. And black's idea here is that in many positions, black will take on c4 and attack the bishop on g5 with the queen. Board vision is a big thing. But Garry plays bishop b4, all the main line. We have queen c2, castles, bishop e2, and personally here with black, I play c5. Garry played in this game e5. Both ways, like I said earlier, black is going to strike back in the center later on, making it difficult for white to castle. Except for the fact that white castles immediately, because there's a tactical way to hold it all together. After pawn takes d4, you don't just take back, you play this move knight to b3. Another benefit of moving the knight back and over, because you end up targeting that queen to slow down its initiative. We have queen back, takes, a5, a4, queen c7, and here Magnus Carlsen plays the first new move in chess history at that time, rook to e1. This position had been seen before, but not a lot. h6, bishop back to h4, and here Garry plays bishop to d6. I mean, very obvious threat, and very obvious defense. Pawn is attacked, you push pawn. Sometimes chess is an easy game. But here, Garry played the move knight b6, which is very direct. First of all, he removes the guard of that knight, but he attacks the bishop. Now here, Magnus took on f6, immediately taking advantage of the fact that this knight has moved, because if Garry were to take back, this is game over. Here there is a beautiful knockout punch. This is why you always look for checks. Queen to g6, and you can't take because of the pin on the pawn, and then you just clean up the pawns and, well, you win. You probably will bring your rook later on, and it will just be game over, or your knight, or even bring your bishop back. Now that is not how the game ended. That would have been crazy. Instead, Garry took on c4. But in this position, I'm pretty sure that Garry missed the move. Now, I have not spoken to Garry, and Garry, if you ever watch this video in the future, please know that I am not insulting you or your intelligence if you actually did not miss this idea. But here, Magnus plays a really cool move. You would think that he has to move his bishop, but Magnus finds a nice move, knight e4, which is just brilliant. Now the knight is hanging here, and if you take me, I'm going to take and infiltrate with my queen, and it's game over. Check here, check here, check here, checkmate with a pawn. You can't go to the e file because of my rook. Now, if that was the way the game ended, I mean, I don't know, that would have been incredible. But, you know, we're talking about Garry Kasparov, probably the greatest player of all time, if not the, then second, although not according to everybody. Garry played check, king h1, and this is actually what you see on footage in the video. So here, Garry backs the knight up, and that disconnects the queen from the bishop. Magnus takes here, and now there is a check and an attack on the bishop. Magnus plays here, and Garry just immediately jumps the knight back, right? You see him just very quickly do it. He has to, because this is under attack, and so is this, and this is the only way to guard both. And then you see Garry kind of, you know, visibly frustrated. So I'm not sure what he missed in this sequence, but he's clearly worse here. The only thing that's going for him is the fact that Magnus doesn't have a lot of time. Also, you know, Garry is like the GOAT, so that's also kind of a problem for Magnus. Why this position is so much better for White? Well, White's got a really strong initiative. White has another target on a5, a very nagging pin, a lot of black pieces aren't developed, and now Magnus just starts throwing it all forward, which I love. I love that he's not sitting timid. He's trying to play the best move in the position. He's not playing the man, he's playing the position. Garry now finds queen d7, very creative defense, getting the queen out of the way of the pin, knight to d4, and knight f5. Garry is also not playing the man, or in this case, the 13-year-old kid. He's playing the position. He understands that as ugly as it looks, he's got to defend and he's got to be practical. So Garry sacrifices his c-pawn. He just gives it away. Why? Because in doing so, he kind of makes Magnus's pieces a little bit tangled. This knight only hits the rook. Rook moves out of the way. And now after rook d1, you know, queen e6, it's now time for Garry to start mobilizing the forces. You know, a little bit of pressure here. Bishop is going to come out. Maybe rook is going to come out this way. And Magnus's time is ticking, right? So here we have rook to e1. Computer here suggests a completely absurd move, bishop c7. Moving the bishop out of harm's way, and I guess just going for the a-pawn. So basically the engine's like, yo, go get a second pawn. I mean, I don't care if he's Kasparov, but bishop c7 is a tough move to play, and that's all that Garry needed. He trades, he activates the queen, and now once he's gotten his activity, Magnus has to play more defensively. They trade queens, and some moves later they trade rooks. And again, Garry's not like, I must beat this kid at all costs. No, he's just, you know, he's like, I got outplayed there for a few moves, and now I'm not in a great situation. This kid is still, you know, an international master, grandmaster to be. I got to play the position. They trade some pieces, and ultimately some moves later, after a little bit more trading and shuffling, there is no way Magnus can make progress here, even though he's a pawn up. The big problem is this is an opposite colored bishop endgame. And, well, that should, you know, give you a hint. One bishop patrols in another scope of the another half of the board in scope that one of them can't fight for. So ultimately, you know, they shuffle a little bit, and in this position, this is what happens.
A draw. It's a sensation. Magnus managed to draw against Kasparov. Kasparov couldn't beat Magnus.
Now, if that's the only video you've ever watched on YouTube of this match, you would think, wow, Kasparov couldn't beat Magnus, what? But that's not really the case, because it was a knockout rapid event. That was just the first game. Magnus had to come back and play a second game, and as far as I can tell, I haven't found any footage of that one. So, we're going to take a look at it. We're going to take a look at that game now. So, the next game, Garry's got the white pieces again, and he goes back to c4. Right? Because we just saw that in the Blitz game. I didn't see no footage of that Blitz game or this second rapid game. All right, so we get c4, knight to f6, and this time a King's Indian defense by Magnus Carlsen, which is kind of interesting because Garry Kasparov himself played the King's Indian defense with the black pieces for many years. So kind of interesting to see that from Magnus. Magnus plays e5. Bishop to e3 from Garry. Now here the main line is considered, you know, you can castle, knight c6, and then your pawn goes to d5. But Garry plays it in a slightly different way, and Magnus plays c6, f3. This kind of pawn structure by white is kind of like the Maroczy. You restrict your opponent on the light squares. Rook e8, bishop f2. Magnus Carlsen, very principled, plays the move d5. It's a great move. You've got to strike back in the center against this kind of Maroczy setup because white doesn't have enough time to set it up here. We have e takes d5, c takes d5, and now Kasparov plays a nice idea, c5. It's so rare that like these pawn pushes in the middle of a position could be good, but they are, because that pawn's not easy to target. First of all, this bishop kind of indirectly guards it, because anywhere this knight moves, whatever ends up on that square will be under attack. And you've got the pawns, you have a knight, and, you know, you'll have the whole village pretty soon. So we get knight c6, Garry castles to get his king out of the center, knight to h5. So again, we have bishop and knight getting all tactical up in here, queen to d2. Why queen to d2? Well, he wants to connect his rooks. He wants a little bit more reinforcement, maybe to fight along the diagonal. Generally not a bad move. Bishop to e5. Garry says, you know what, I'm not a big fan of getting checkmated, so g3. And g3 has another purpose. He wants to go f4. Make no mistake, he wants to punish Magnus for putting his bishop out there in the center of the board to be a target. So, bishop to h3, rook e1. It looks like, you know, Magnus is making progress. But Garry's more than equipped, you know, basically his point is that you're going to get overextended. Here, Magnus goes back, plays knight back to g7. Which is a peculiar move, because he didn't have to do that. Maybe he was afraid, you know, he was afraid of g4 or something like that. And f4, for example, so he was like, you know what, before Garry gets all hostile with me, I'm going to back up. But Garry plays the very simple rook d1. That is exactly why he moved his queen up, because now that pawn is a target. An isolated pawn should be blockaded and then captured. Garry has completed step 1. So, rook to c8, knight to b5, a6. Where's this knight going? Is it just going back? Nah, you would have thought it's going to d6. Forcing bishop takes and now pawn takes. Justifying that advance a long time ago. He makes that forward progress. Now to the uninitiated, queen takes d6 is just a free pawn. Yeah, but remember this pawn that we loaded up all our guns on? Yeah. Big problem here. So, couple of issues. Number 1, remember that dark squared bishop you put there a long time ago? It's now a horse. I don't know how a bishop became a horse. I don't know how this became a magic show. But that is not the piece that's supposed to be guarding the dark squares. Garry's next move is going to be queen to h6, followed by something targeting that knight, and then mate. Also, queen h6 hits the bishop, which you put there a long time ago. So it felt like Magnus played a few disconnected moves. A few moves that looked good, but were a little bit disconnected, whereas Garry's entire game plan revolved around transferring that knight through the center of the board, making that correct trade, and for that reason, Magnus does not take this pawn and tries to cause some havoc in the center. Knight e4, bishop f5, and now, remember that first game, that pawn push to the 7th rank that was decisive? You remember, right? You were paying attention. Pay attention, okay? Don't just watch this in the background. d7. If you take with the queen, I triple fork you. Now, if you take with the bishop, you lose a guard of this, and I can just take it. And you would say, well, Levy, didn't you say you shouldn't get rid of the dark squared bishop? I didn't say that. I said that black getting rid of their dark squared bishop caused some really bad weaknesses. White getting rid of their dark squared bishop caused some dark squared weaknesses. Name me one piece for black that can go anywhere on this diagonal. If you said queen to b6, it's time to take up checkers, because that loses a queen for free. Queen b6 is quite literally one of the worst moves on the board right now. So, we get knight to f5, but now, queen takes d7. Queen b6 check, king h1, rook d8. But now the only move, otherwise the queen is trapped, queen to a4. Takes, takes b2. Garry plays queen b1, looking for a trade of queens and to hit the b7 pawn. And after that happens, he transfers the bishop to c4, guards his only weakness, targets this, and here on move 32, Magnus Carlsen resigned, therefore being eliminated from this tournament in Reykjavik, and Garry Kasparov moved on. Garry Kasparov also went on to win this tournament, but, you know, he had to get through Magnus Carlsen, which potentially is the most impressive about all this. But that was the earliest instance and rivalry of Magnus Carlsen versus Garry Kasparov. 2004, they played 3 games. If you just watch on YouTube, it makes it look like they only ever played 1 game, because it was super hype, and that video has 10 million views, and you know what they say. Any video with a lot of views has accurate information, no matter what's in the video. I hope I don't get demonetized for making that joke. They played one more time, on record. In 2020, they played at the St. Louis Chess Club. They've also played, I think, some Blitz and things like that, but never anything too serious. But as far as that 2004 incident goes, they did have a positive outcome. So I do have a clip for you at the end of this video, also from that same channel, when Garry visits Magnus in Norway and they talk a little bit about chess. But before I show you that clip, thank you for making it this far in the video. I really do appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed this. If there's any other kind of footage that you want to see of a, you know, 2 goats going at it, Magnus playing someone, Kasparov playing someone, a video I haven't covered, do let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video. But here is the clip.
Magnus has undoubtedly much he can learn from a man like Kasparov. Their rivalry from the tournament in Iceland is behind them, and they quickly find a good tone.
Det var egentlig ganske borti med sjakken, da erfarte jeg hvor mye Kasparov egentlig kunne, hvor god han egentlig var.
Yes, but your king is also, you know, you always have this problem with bishop c2, queen e4, and this is mate. While with bishop here, this threat is no longer relevant. Then this pawn would be in real trouble.